Hello, this is Hendrik, and today we will be baking the lazy man's bread recipe. I always have a few people asking me what is the most simple bread you can bake, and today Sarah is going to bake. It's her first time, and I'm just going to give her the instruction and then we'll see how it turns out. What you need is sourdough, this is the hardest part probably, full grain flour, some salt, some water, a large pot, and a scale. So now we will be adding 500 grams of full grain wheat flour. Two percent salt. Now we will be adding 95% calculated on the flour of water. So that's 475 grams of water. Perfect. That's a little more, but that's no problem. Now we're gonna add our sourdough starter to the bread. And we will be adding 20% calculated on the 500 grams of flour. That's 100 grams of starter. The starter is what kickstarts the fermentation process of the bread. It also adds this slightly sour taste to the bread. That's why it's called sourdough. And this is called the sourdough starter. Feeding your starter and so on, that's a whole other topic. But this is just about making a really simple bread. Okay, perfect. Now just stir this. Make sure that nothing sticks at the bottom of the pot. We will not be kneading anything. Again, baking a really good bread with an open crumb and so on would take a few more steps, but since this is lazy man's bread recipe and we're really trying to get the most or the best bread possible with as little work as possible, we are not doing all the steps, but this is gonna create us a really amazing bread. So everything is stirred now. There's a little bit more flour. And now the fermentation process is starting. The yeast is gonna start eating the grain, it's gonna produce the gas, and that's gonna make the bread raise, and that will create the fluffy crumb. Yeah, you don't want to end up with a couple of loose flour parts. Make sure that everything is really nicely stirred. You don't have to use a spatula, you can also just use a spoon. But we didn't want to scratch the bottom of the pot, that's why we're using the spatula. Perfect. I think that's looking very good. And now we need to cover this with the pot, with the top of the pot, to make sure it doesn't dehydrate. Exactly. And now we're gonna leave this for 7 hours. This depends on the temperature of your kitchen, but in our case it's around 19 degrees. so that's 7 hours. But if it's a little bit colder, it might take more. If it's a little bit warmer, it's going to take less. See you soon. 7 hours have passed and the dough doubled in size roughly. Now we need to put the dough to the loaf pan for final proofing. For that, make sure that you add some oil to the loaf pan. In this case, we're using olive oil, but you can also use any other oil, whatever you prefer. Perfect. And now just use some paper and spread it evenly in the loaf pan. That way the dough will not stick. If you omitted this step, your dough would stick to the loaf pan. So this is quite important. Looking perfect. Now, let's add this dough to the loaf pan. Exactly. You could also, instead of using a spatula, just to use a regular spoon. Spatula makes it a bit easier because it's a little less sticky. Now spread the dough a little more evenly in the loaf pan. And we need to let it proof for another 3 hours or 24 hours in the fridge. In our case, we're going to put it 24 hours in the fridge. The oven spring is a little bit better when it's fermented in the fridge, but you can also do it at room temperature. 24 hours passed, and this is how the dough looks like now, really bubbly. We're gonna place it in the oven now at 230 degrees Celsius. Make sure your oven has been preheated for around 20 to 30 minutes. Then we're gonna bake it for 45 minutes. We finished baking the bread, and this is how it looks like. It looks very crusty and nice. Make sure that you let it cool down for at least an hour before cutting it. Let's see how the crumb looks like inside. Amazing. And it's really moist because we used so high hydration. If you were to use a Benetton, you couldn't go this high in hydration. But this only works for the loaf pan. Thanks for watching and enjoy.